They say money can't buy happiness, but I learned it can certainly purchase respect. At 72, I discovered that the checkbook I'd been writing from for decades was also the source of my worth in my own family's eyes. The day I closed that account was the day I opened a new chapter of my life. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who would have to fight for basic dignity in her own home. For 47 years, I lived in the same colonial house, with the wraparound porch and the garden I'd tended with my own hands. My husband passed 8 years ago, leaving me with memories, a modest inheritance, and what I thought was a loving relationship with my only son and his family. How naive I was to believe that love and respect were the same thing. My son moved back into our family home after his divorce, bringing his 2 teenage children with him. At first, I welcomed them with open arms. The house had felt too quiet, too empty since my husband's passing. I thought having family around would bring life back into these walls. I converted my sewing room into a bedroom for my granddaughter, moved my craft supplies to the basement, and gladly shared my kitchen and living spaces. I told myself this arrangement was temporary, just until he got back on his feet financially. That was 3 years ago. In the beginning, I convinced myself that the small slights were just adjustments we all needed to make. When my son would use my car without asking, leaving me stranded when I had doctor's appointments, I told myself he was just stressed about his new job. When my granddaughter would invite friends over and they'd leave pizza boxes and soda cans scattered around my living room, I cleaned up without complaint, reasoning she was just being a typical teenager. When my grandson would play his music so loud that my neighbors started giving me pointed looks, I approached him gently, asking him to lower the volume, only to be told I was being dramatic. The pattern established itself slowly, like water wearing away stone. My son would promise to help with household expenses, then find reasons why he couldn't contribute that month. The utilities, the groceries, the property taxes, the maintenance. Everything continued to come out of my fixed income and savings. When I brought up the financial strain, he'd remind me how much I was saving on loneliness, how lucky I was to have family around, how other elderly women would kill for this arrangement. I started eating smaller portions so there would be enough food for everyone. I kept the thermostat lower in winter to manage the heating bills. I postponed my own medical appointments when my grandson needed money for school activities or my granddaughter wanted new clothes. I told myself these were the sacrifices grandmothers made, that this was what family meant. The disrespect grew bolder as months turned into years. My son would make major decisions about the house without consulting me, like when he had cable internet installed in every room and added premium channels I never watched. When the bill came, he'd shrug and say it was necessary for the kids' schoolwork. My granddaughter would roll her eyes when I'd ask her to help with dishes, muttering about how I had nothing better to do anyway. My grandson would interrupt my phone conversations with friends, claiming he needed the kitchen table for homework, even though his room had a perfectly good desk. I found myself apologizing constantly. Sorry for asking them to clean up after themselves. Sorry for needing the car for my own errands. Sorry for requesting they keep the noise down during my afternoon rest. Sorry for existing in my own home. The social isolation crept in gradually. My friends stopped calling as often because the phone was always busy with the teenagers' social lives. When they did call, I had to compete with television noise and video games for the ability to have a conversation. I stopped hosting my book club because my son complained about the noise the ladies made. I quit my volunteer work at the library because I never knew when someone would need the car. My world shrank to the size of my bedroom and the corner of the kitchen where I kept my tea supplies. I began to feel like a boarder in my own home, grateful for any small kindness, walking on eggshells, to avoid being seen as a burden. The woman who had once organized community fundraisers and managed a household of 5 became someone who whispered thank you for being allowed to watch her own television. The financial abuse escalated so gradually I almost didn't notice it. First, My son asked to be added to my checking account so he could help manage my bills. Then he suggested we streamline everything by having all the household expenses automatically withdrawn from that account. Before I knew it, my Social Security deposits and pension payments were being absorbed into a household budget I had no control over. When I asked to see the monthly statements, he'd wave them away, saying everything was handled, that I shouldn't worry about such complicated financial matters at my age. When I persisted, he'd show me carefully selected pages that made it look like every penny was accounted for. But I noticed my balance never seemed to grow, even though my expenses had supposedly decreased with their help. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in November. I had been feeling unwell for several days, experiencing chest pains that concerned me enough to want to see my doctor immediately. When I asked my son to drive me to an urgent appointment, he said he couldn't leave work. When I asked to borrow the car, he reminded me that I wasn't supposed to drive anymore because of my eyesight. Something he'd decided unilaterally after I'd bumped the mailbox once while backing out. I called my granddaughter's cell phone, hoping she could drive me. She was at school, but I caught her during lunch. She sighed heavily into the phone and told me she had cheerleading practice after school and couldn't possibly miss it for something that probably wasn't even serious. She suggested I call an ambulance if I was really worried, but said it dramatically, as if she knew I was just being a hypochondriac. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, realizing I had no way to get medical care when I needed it. In my own home, surrounded by family, I was more isolated than I'd been when I lived alone. The chest pains turned out to be anxiety, but the revelation they brought was very real. That evening, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called my old friend Margaret, someone I hadn't spoken to in months because I'd been too embarrassed about my living situation. I asked her to pick me up the next morning and take me to the bank. When she asked why, I told her I needed to take control of my finances again. Margaret arrived early, looking concerned, but not asking too many questions. At the bank, I requested to see the statements for the past year. What I found made my hands shake. Hundreds of dollars in cash withdrawals I'd never made. Charges at restaurants I'd never been to. Online purchases for electronics and clothes that had never entered my house. My son had been systematically draining my accounts while telling me we were barely breaking even on household expenses. The bank manager, a kind woman about my son's age, helped me open a new account that morning. I transferred my Social Security and pension to direct deposit there. I removed my son's name from all my accounts. When she asked if I wanted to file a report for financial abuse, I wasn't ready for that step yet. But I took the paperwork home with me. That afternoon, when my son came home from work, I was waiting at the kitchen table with bank statements spread in front of me. His face went through several expressions when he saw what I was looking at. Surprise, guilt, anger, and finally, manipulation. He immediately went on the offensive, telling me I was confused, that I'd authorized all those transactions, that I was getting forgetful and couldn't be trusted to manage money anymore. When I remained calm and pointed to specific unauthorized withdrawals, he switched tactics, claiming he'd borrowed the money for emergencies and had intended to pay it back. When I asked about the restaurant charges and online shopping, he became angry, accusing me of being ungrateful after everything he'd done for me. I let him talk himself into a corner before I spoke. My voice was steadier than I expected when I told him that I'd moved my income to a new account and that he would need to start paying rent if he wanted to continue living in my house. The look of shock on his face told me he'd never considered that I might fight back. The next few days were tense. My son alternated between being furious and trying to guilt me into changing my mind. He told me I was being unreasonable, that families should support each other, that he was doing me a favor by living there. My grandchildren joined in, telling me I was being mean to their father, that I was trying to ruin their lives. I weathered their emotional manipulation by reminding myself of those bank statements. Numbers don't lie, even when the people you love do. Within a week, my son announced he'd found an apartment and would be moving out by the end of the month. He said it with the air of someone doing me a favor, as if my enforcing reasonable boundaries was an inconvenience he was graciously accommodating. My grandchildren barely spoke to me in those final weeks, treating me like I'd betrayed the family. The day they moved out, I stood in my empty house and felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Peace. The silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was mine. I could walk through my own home without apologizing for existing. I could answer my phone without competing with background noise. I could eat a full meal without calculating whether there would be enough for everyone else. The first month alone was an adjustment. I had to relearn how to fill my days without revolving around other people's schedules and needs. I called Margaret and asked if her book club was still meeting. I returned to volunteering at the library. I scheduled the medical appointments I'd been postponing and took care of dental work I'd delayed to save money for the family budget. Most importantly, I began to understand the difference between being alone and being lonely. For 3 years, I'd been profoundly lonely while surrounded by family. Now, living alone again, I felt connected to myself and my own life for the first time in years. My son called occasionally during those first months, usually when he needed money. I listened to his requests calmly and declined politely. When he accused me of being selfish, I reminded him that I'd supported him and his children for 3 years without complaint, and that it was time for him to support his own family. These conversations were painful, but necessary. The grandchildren were harder to navigate. They'd been caught in the middle of an adult situation they didn't fully understand. I sent birthday cards with modest gift cards and left the door open for a relationship on healthier terms. But I didn't chase them or try to buy their affection back. 6 months after they moved out, my granddaughter called me. She'd started college and was struggling financially. Instead of asking for money directly, she told me about her challenges and waited for me to offer help. I listened with compassion, but explained that her father was responsible for supporting her education, just as my parents had been responsible for supporting mine. It was a difficult conversation, but I could hear in her voice that she understood my position better than she had when she was living in my house. As the seasons changed, I began to reclaim my home and my life. I redecorated the rooms that had been taken over by others, choosing colors and furniture that pleased me rather than accommodating everyone else's preferences. I planted a larger vegetable garden that spring, knowing I could enjoy the full harvest myself, or share it by choice rather than necessity. The financial recovery took longer than the emotional healing. I had to rebuild my savings and adjust my budget to live within my actual means rather than supporting a household of 4. But for the first time in years, I knew exactly where my money was going, and every dollar spent was my decision. A year after establishing my boundaries, my son asked to meet me for coffee. He looked older, more tired, but also more humble than I'd seen him since his divorce. He apologized for taking advantage of my generosity and admitted he'd been angry about his own life circumstances and had unfairly taken it out on me. He didn't ask to move back, didn't request money, and didn't try to minimize what had happened. I accepted his apology because forgiveness was part of my healing process, but I also made it clear that our relationship would be different going forward. I would be his mother, but I wouldn't be his financial safety net. I would love his children, but I wouldn't enable their disrespect. I would welcome them in my home as guests, but not as permanent residents who took my generosity for granted. Now, 2 years later, we have Sunday dinners once a month. My son pays for the groceries and helps with the cleanup. My grandchildren are polite and appreciative when they visit. We're building a relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. And while it's smaller than what we had before, it's healthier and more genuine. I learned that setting boundaries isn't about building walls, it's about building gates with hinges. People can still come into your life, but only on terms that preserve your dignity and well-being. I learned that saying no to disrespect isn't selfish, it's self-preservation. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to reclaim your life, even when the people you have to reclaim it from are the ones you love most. The woman who once apologized for existing in her own home now walks through these rooms with quiet confidence. I may be older, but I'm not weaker. I may be alone more often, but I'm not lonely. I may have a smaller family circle, but the relationships I have now are built on genuine affection rather than financial convenience. Every morning when I wake up in my own bed, in my own house, living by my own rules, I'm reminded that respect isn't something you can buy or demand. It's something you teach people to give you by refusing to accept anything less. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to stop enabling them to treat you badly. The checkbook is still in my name, but more importantly, so is my life.